Michael Vale had been good at pretending the world bent to reason. He wore suits that looked like arguments and kept his files immaculate because order is how he told himself he still mattered. For 12 years, he had built a modest practice doing divorce settlements and bankruptcy reorganizations, the kind of work that smelled of stale coffee and recalculated lives. He was no star at the bar, but he could read witnesses and find the one fact that made a judge tilt. When the hospital bill arrived, 3 months of chemotherapy and one impatient surgeon's estimate, the numbers on his spreadsheets stopped feeling theoretical and started to have teeth. His savings were a neat arithmetic of lost deals and tuition sent early. His partner had left, saying lawyers shouldn't marry beneath their ambitions. His bank manager had used the word unstable with a kind patience that felt like a stiletto. Michael did what lawyers do when the law does not answer. He negotiated with creditors, sold the car that had once been practical and now looked like an indulgence, and borrowed from friends until the habit of owing made even his voice sound thin. The final notice for the mortgage arrived on a day so wet, the city looked like a photograph left in rain. He walked to the hospital that afternoon, carrying the envelope and hope in separate pockets. And when his daughter pressed damp crayons into his hand, he smiled and told her they were going to be okay. He lied with the quiet, practiced cruelty of a man who promised himself a future he could not afford. Salvatore Moretti had the kind of presence that made men tidy their lies. He wore the weather of old money and the casual cruelty of someone used to ends being immediate. The Morettis had been part of the city's scaffolding for decades. Real estate, unions, logistics, and other enterprises a reputable ledger would describe as complex. Michael had met Sal once before, in a municipal hearing where Sal's men had argued against a zoning restriction with a confidence born of purchase. Sal's call came on a Tuesday evening, a number that did not appear in Michael's contacts. He answered because the inside of his apartment felt like a lobby where bad news sat waiting. "Michael Vale," Sal said, like he was testing a name for a good fit. "I need a clean hand." The proposition came without drama. Sal offered to clear Michael's mortgage, to cover the remainder of the medical bills, to make a donation in his daughter's name that would look like salvation and read like charity. In exchange, Sal needed Michael to sign off on a transfer of assets for a client, a simple trust restructuring, just the kind of paperwork any careful lawyer would draw. "A favor," Sal said. "We help each other." Michael thought of the hospital corridors, of the nights he had calculated how long he could keep the lights on. He imagined the ledger the bank would release if asked, and his mind did the arithmetic like the hand on a gravestone. Trade a signature for a life. He thought, in a voice that surprised him for its cowardice and its clarity, "Who am I to stand between a man and the breathing of my family?" The question sounded small in his head and enormous in his life. The work began like legal breakfast, forms, notarizing, a transaction wrapped in euphemisms. Sal's men arrived at Michael's office with clean shoes and cleaner patience. Documents were slid across the desk like contraband with a polite edge. Michael drew the trust paperwork, described the beneficiaries in clinical phrases, and watched the pen move between names that would mean money and names that would mean silence. He rationalized as lawyers do: due diligence, chain of title, fiduciary duty. Each paragraph he typed made the ledger greasier elsewhere, but each paragraph also bought him another day of medicine and another month of rent. Sal asked for additional services, a shell company set up for transport logistics, a nominee director to sign where discretion would be useful. These were small cruelties dressed in corporate jargon. Michael walked the line like someone who had learned to measure his own moral speed. He told himself he would stop when the mortgage was safe, when the hospital bills were paid, when the last note cleared the ledger of his debts. His first-person thoughts came at night in the small hours, merciless and precise. This is temporary. It's a bridge. It is not me. The phrase was a rope he could clutch, though he knew ropes fray. Sal's men were efficient, but deals always demand proof of reliability. Michael was given tasks that tested not expertise, but his willingness to bend the law's subtler seams. He arranged for a contract to be awarded to a construction firm favored by Sal, drafting clauses that hid kickbacks in maintenance allowances and consulting fees. He advised on a quiet land swap, repositioning municipal easements in ways that favored property parcels Sal's ownership shell could acquire quietly. Each time Michael signed, the city record moved like the hand of a dealer sliding a card. He justified this by the practical effect at home. The med bills paid in full, an envelope delivered to the hospital where a child's blood work no longer announced a pause in breathing. But the favors grew in ambition. Sal wanted a witness, someone standing in the way of a development, to be discredited. Michael found himself drafting a motion that summoned private financial records into public view with the rhetorical flourish of a prosecutor. It was legal work, all of it, but it was the kind of legal work that stripped people of defense through the slow violence of paper and court schedules. The first time he saw the effect in person, on the face of a woman whose home would be seized if a title dispute went through, something cold uncoiled inside him. He remembered his daughter's crayon-damp cheeks and thought, first person and without editorial gloss, I have set my hand to a ledger that marks other people's lives off in my name. Where bargains start, surveillance follows. Sal's requirement for trust did not end at signatures. He asked Michael for loyalty, for the kidney of the thing. Secrecy. He wanted Michael to be available for quick counsels, to speak on the phone in certain cadences, to send emails that read like routine legal advice but carried the scent of coercion. Michael complied because he had begun to confuse supply lines with lifelines. The first threat made public was small, an anonymous envelope with photos of his daughter jogging outside school and a typed note that read, simply, "Do not disappoint us." He had called the police and been met with a bored officer who took the envelope like a piece of theater and told him to document everything. The act of documentation felt like betrayal. He wanted to stand tall and say no. Instead, he stared at the photos until the paper blurred. He started to learn the geography of fear, which doors to lock, which nights to sleep with the closet light on. His lawyerly mind tried to keep things legal, get a restraining order, find an off-duty cop, file an FOIA on Sal's operations. The system bent partially. Sal bent more easily. When one of Michael's documents stalled a transfer because of a careful clerk's question, Sal replaced the clerk with a man whose resume read like a flat sheet of ice. The transfer went through. The hospital called to say Michael's payments had cleared. He cried once under that fluorescent light, a short, sharp misery. And then he met Sal for the first time in person at a private room in a restaurant that smelled of oil and expensive patience. Sal sipped wine and said, nearly sweetly, "You did good work." Michael thought he heard a judge sentence with that phrase. Guilt arrived in more dangerous shapes than paperwork. Sal's need for control was not satisfied by legal black magic alone. He wanted the city not just altered, but obedient. He expanded expectations, plant an article against a critic, intimidate a councilman into a favorable vote, ensure a public hearing yielded the result Sal paid for. Each new task felt more like violence because it asked Michael not to harm property, but to methodically harm people's reputations and livelihoods. Michael watched the threads he pulled tangle into lives he knew. A clerk who had once babysat for him losing her job after a smear. A neighborhood organizer's donor list leaked. He began to keep a private ledger of his own. Names of the people he had harmed. Dates. The documents he had prepared. And next to each, an ugly column calculating what it had bought him. He could have stopped, he knew. He could have gone to the feds. He could have walked into a courthouse and confessed in exchange for protection. But the feds move on probabilities and evidence. Sal's world had already begun to rearrange the evidence on his own terms. Michael thought in first person more often now. Not illusions, but rueful admissions. I sold my silence for breathing. I am complicit, and they know how to squeeze it. The awareness made him small and practical. He stopped trusting his phone's silence and began to trust the weight of the brass key to his office safe. The reckoning came with the kind of cruelty that smelt like inevitability. Nora, the clerk who had once taken his court filings across town, was found with her car rammed into a tree. It read as an accident until someone found the anonymous email that had outed her as an embezzler. Michael's handiwork turned into Sal's leverage. The police took the embezzlement angle seriously long enough to justify a quiet search of Nora's apartment that turned up nothing but shredded receipts and the wreckage of reputation. Michael learned of the crash from a voicemail on his home line, one of those machine-recorded messages that play back like a country had closed its borders. When he went to visit the hospital, he found Nora pale and furious, and underneath the fury, very human. "Why?" she demanded, not at him as a lawyer, but at him as a neighbor, someone who had worn civility as a mask for convenience. His answers felt useless beside the fluorescent hum of a room that smelled of antiseptic and cheap flowers. Sal called that night, slow and satisfied. "You're lightening the city," he said. "You make room for better investments." The words were a fist. Michael heard the city itself as the body he had promised to protect, and felt the hands that had sold it for safety. There were tiny rebellions. Michael met with a retired prosecutor, a woman who had no appetite for glory, but an old habit for righting wrongs. He passed to her copies of emails, the trust documents, the transfer memos, enough to build probable cause if someone had the stomach to follow the paper. He slept irregularly in a motel and tried to calibrate courage like a man learning shorthand. One night, in a quiet hour, he sat at his daughter's kitchen table and told her enough of the truth to explain why they might have to move, to leave friends and rent and the small certainties of routine. She listened the way children listen to fables about monsters, acceptance with a faint shine of bravery. "If they take me, keep living," he told her in first person, and as if he were laying down a final argument. He began to plan, not to finish Sal's work, but to undo it, to leak the ledger to journalists, to create a chain of custody that could survive the hands that refused evidence. Sal found out faster than a reasonable man would expect. Betrayal in his world was an arithmetic with few decimals. Someone leaked, and Sal's men closed the net. The end was not sudden like a gunshot, but surgical like a room sealed. The retired prosecutor arranged a meeting with an investigative team and set up a transfer of evidence that would strand Sal's legal scaffolding in public view. Michael delivered files with hands that did not shake for once but felt steady, as a man who has accepted the shape of a noose. The team worked with a caution that tasted like cold metal. Raids, sealed warrants, arrests timed with hearings where the press could place the spectacle between a headline and a subhead. Sal's lawyers moved in instants, as lawyers will, and the courtroom became a theater where reputations were unspooled with the slow, public cruelty of a scalpel. Sal was indicted on charges that read like the pages Michael had typed: conspiracy, money laundering, witness tampering. Public hearings showed how trusts had been used to shift titles and how a web of nominees and shell companies had made the city's private ambitions invisible until the wrong person turned the light on them. It was not clean. Men walked free on technicalities. Some of Sal's guards turned state's evidence for lighter sentences. Nora's name was cleared quietly at last. She wept the kind of tears that asked for no apology, because none could be fully given. Michael's reprieve was narrow and costly. The prosecutor's team negotiated a plea arrangement that required his testimony and the stripping of the legal license he'd once carried, with the same calmness he had used to sign papers. The board voted, and Michael's name was removed from the roll. He would never again call himself counsel. He paid fines and accepted community service in exchange for reduced charges. Sal would not vanish into a long sentence on the first try. He had resources and the language of lawyers at his back, but the city, for once, had evidence to answer its own questions. Michael lost clients, a practice, and the tidy arrogance of believing work and law were identical. He kept, oddly, his daughter's trust and a quiet apartment on the edge of town. On nights when the rain came, he sat at the kitchen table and turned the small ledger he'd kept, not of shell companies, but of the people he'd tried to repair. He thought in first person with a blunt, honest ache. I did a terrible thing to save what I loved, and it took me a long time to learn saving can mean giving what you owe back. He had cut a deal with a man who wore the city's shadow as a badge, and he had paid for it with reputation and a fee his soul could measure in small, careful increments. The devil's bargain left him breathing, but it also left him with the job of saying to himself and to his daughter every morning what honesty costs and what it might yet buy.